Hey, good morning. Welcome to our Midweek podcast. This is episode 138. My name's Jerry Hendricks, and I'm here with Teek Hamilton. Teek, do you know we've been doing this for a long time?
138 episodes is a long time.
It is a long time, and we are approaching 10,000 downloads.
Wow. That's a lot. We were excited when we hit 1,000.
I know, it seems like a lot.
Yeah, when we hit 1,000, we did cookies.
I know. We did. We're not celebrating enough.
Agreed.
Anyways, we're glad you folks have joined us. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, we'd encourage you to comment, like, or share that with us so that we can have more people a part of the experience that we have together. We enjoy being here each week, and we're glad to welcome you into this conversation.
This conversation started Sunday, though.
It sure
with the
did.
gospel.
It started Sunday with brand new series, brand new book of the Bible, and we're up and running.
And we're going to be in Galatians for a while.
Right.
But that's okay. That's our summer series.
That's right. During the summer, we explained this Sunday. If you want to go back and listen to a part of that podcast, we feel like it's important for people to know that the rhythm that we create here for our conversations is intentional. It's something that's spread out over a calendar year. And during the summer, we focus a little bit more on a more narrow scope as far as topic. And oftentimes it's a book study. So this summer it's going to be the book of Galatians, and we are into our first week, and it's going real good.
When you talked about gospel over and over again the last week with Wednesday night and Sunday morning, a couple times I heard you asking the question, what is the gospel to you? Did you have any answers that kind of surprised you or that were unique or anything like that? Not to call anybody out.
No,
not weird.
I mean, but I think we tried that with a few in our office, and then we tried it on Wednesday night. And most people come up with the same ideas as far as how they describe the gospel. I think the simplest answer to that is good news, and I believe that's a pretty strong New Testament influence as far as what the gospel means. I think that as we think about it, it is a conversation that in our culture, our church culture anyway, it's been a strong conversation for the last 4 or 5 years probably, and so it's good that we get a chance to talk about this and approach it from the perspective of Paul as he sort of introduces that repeatedly in those first 10 verses actually, and then we kind of start dissecting that as we continue to go through the gospel.
It's interesting to me that like Mark starts off his gospel with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then Paul, who wasn't even ever around Jesus outside of his experience of salvation, talks about gospel immediately in one of the first letters he writes.
Right, and he does get into this, and we go into some of the reasons why he approached it this way. It is important to the start of the church, and it's important in particular to the Galatian churches.
Yeah, I think it's natural though, like what Paul's battling. It's natural to add things to the gospel, like you said, that we can't just be satisfied or be comfortable with, I guess, a gospel based on grace alone and what Christ has done. We feel like there should be some rules we have to follow to fit in that context.
Yeah, and I think that's where if we could have spent more time on Sunday, that's kind of what we would have tried to, or I would have tried to unpack a little bit more. It's just this idea that a lot of times we make the gospel or we make grace an add-on gospel, or not grace, but we create an add-on gospel.
Right.
And that was at least a phrase that I tried to use on Sunday to help us understand that the gospel really in its essence is very simple. It's something that we can understand and something that we can respond to. But once we get to that place where we start adding on to what being a believer means or being a disciple means, that's when we start to get in trouble. And what I felt like was difficult is when you look at the context of Galatians, their add-on gospel was a lot different than what we're going to deal with, right? Because the add-on gospel came from their past, from their religious past, and so it was hard for them to move into to change and something new and understanding something. And as they were trying to understand it, they were really forcing believers to follow along behind the old gospel for them, or the old news of how they related to God. And so that created problems, and then Paul was a little upset about that.
Yeah, he was a little vocal on that part.
Yeah, he was pretty direct about it, and but so in our culture, I think those add-ons look different.
But
definitely. I think we tend to think of them as behavioral changes
Right.
that create expectations for what a person that follows Christ is.
Right. That was my next thing from hearing your conversation Sunday and thinking about that over the last couple of days. By having add-ons to the gospel, that's how we make the gospel exclusive. We kind of begin to move to that Pharisee mode, that's a weird accent, the Pharisee mode, and we begin saying, this is the gospel because we've achieved that. And then we're not reaching out the way we should, because we expect people to fix themselves before they experience the gospel or before they accept the gospel.
Right. That's a really good approach to that, and that I think that's Paul understood that. I mean, when you listen to the way that he teaches and shares his life and message with people, I mean, he talks a lot about that. But the part that they continue to struggle with was just, this idea that they had all along, that there were things that they could do. And then too, the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that pretty much automatically excluded the Gentiles.
Right.
So they were going through this process of trying to convince them of certain aspects of their life that needed to shift, become more Jewish, so that they could be followers of Christ.
And it might not always be how we convey the gospel. Sometimes there's already that impression out there that because of how we live or the reputation Christians have, that people have to clean themselves up before they come to experience Christ.
Right. I think you're right. There's a lot of that people are struggling with prior to coming to be involved in a faith community anyway.
Right.
And so it doesn't help that when they arrive at a church or a place, that their message continues to reinforce that.
Right.
And so I think that, it's, to me, you try to help people focus on who they are in Christ, and continue to work with that where they are, and trust that God's going to work that out. That's the tension that I felt like in our world. We talk about tension a lot, and we embrace the tension between the kinds of things. Paul didn't do that, and that's where I believe my exact phrase was, Paul wrecks the tension.
Right.
He doesn't even acknowledge that there could be any tension between these, and he stated very clearly what the gospel should look like.
Which for Paul, you'd think that would be a difficult move, maybe an internal struggle because of his background as a Pharisee and all the things that he did. You'd think that'd be hard for him not to have an add-on gospel, to be able to accept it. But I guess when you're blinded by Jesus, that
it does get your attention. Anyway, and the other thing about him too, we know that he's very grace and freedom oriented, and that those themes tend to emerge later in this letter and then throughout his other writings. And so for him to land so squarely on this one, he really put his foot down on this.
Right, and that's probably why he fights back so hard against even the apostles at the time, and goes back at Peter back and forth with him about it, because he doesn't want Peter being the cause of these issues.
Right, and to have such a deep understanding of this so early in faith life is interesting to me, because we're still struggling as you think through just the timeline, the Jesus timeline, the real-time experience. These people were really learning as they went, and trying to assimilate the message of Jesus, his life and legacy, and what that was going to mean, and then life with him. And so for Paul already to have this deep understanding of the theology that we really embrace today is really pretty impressive.
And I'm guessing that this attitude was kind of pervasive as far as this understanding of add-ons to the gospel, because isn't Galatians written to like several different churches, and so it's like passed around, and so this was probably a regional matter also. Right.
This book in particular, I think there's argument over what parts of Galatia we're talking about here, northern or southern, and some of the influence that Rome would have in those two areas, and how that might vary. But it was a letter that's written not to a specific church, but to several churches in a region. So yeah.
So no wonder he's so passionate about it, because this has a chance to take hold and be a bad thing.
Well, yeah, he's already learned how a very, very concise message can begin to fragment over time, and so he's kind of bringing all that stuff back together for the people there.
Well, I like, for gospel good news, I mean, that's the one that speaks clearly, I think, to everybody when you're talking about it. So I like that part of the definition, is this idea of just good news, that Jesus Christ is good news.
Right, and that's the definition. When we start asking people what the gospel was, that was the majority of what we heard, that people would use that reference, and some had a little bit deeper or longer answer to that, but that's probably the most concise definition of what the gospel is.
Does the gospel and what we've done so far in conversation, does that still fit with love first?
I think it does too.
Okay, just making sure.
And look at you. You're
there's a slow pitch softball right there.
You're embracing that with your Love First T-shirt today. Our mission, as we stated here, is to be the first responders of God's love, and so very, very much so, the gospel helps us to keep us moving forward and being that in our role in the community. The gospel ultimately becomes something that life reflects, and that's a part of, in everyone that's a part of church, particularly a church that's been around as long as our church has been. We've had different ways that we interpreted the gospel and how we tried to present gospel. But in New Testament, it's really pretty much just simply through living gospel.
Right.
It wasn't through campaigns and initiatives. And so hopefully we can find that place where, as we learn to love first, that does become a part of the gospel. That is the gospel presentation to the world as they see those demonstrations of God's love.
I think that's the question you ended with, or came to end with at the end of the conversation. Man, I'm struggling. The end of the conversation Sunday. How will you live out? How will your life reflect the gospel? How will you live out the gospel this week? And I think that's a good question to think about. But it's pretty much answered in love first, also, and how you live that out.
And there's grace and freedom in that.
Right.
But there's also we can't relieve ourselves from the responsibility. And just the assumption that it would happen. And I think that we have to be not just attentive. When we talk about the gospel and presenting the gospel, a lot of times we're talking about the action of the gospel, rather than some of the things that might lead up to that. Praying, as we begin our day, that there may be people that we encounter that God brings across our path, that in a variety of ways we might be the gospel to them.
Right.
And then, so I think prayer is definitely a big part of what this looks like ultimately, in terms of the good news and love first, and then just being ready. So we're praying, but then we're also being attentive as we walk through life. And the way I described it Sunday is that's really the kingdom formula. That's it wasn't something that was put on a brochure and then handed out and all of us went out and did something, but rather it's just a way of life.
Right. I think you mentioned the add-ons of like handing out, knocking door to door, things like that. That's easy.
Right.
As awkward as it might be at times, that's easy. Living out the gospel is way more difficult.
Right. And I think somehow we have to turn up the accountability in our life on that, and make sure that we're living life passionately, and that we in that love for life, people understand that it's motivated by our love for Christ.
Right.
And so it's not an easier path. It can sound that way, but it's not. And I do think that it does require far more accountability and willingness to put ourselves there, so that we're dependent upon Christ to create that in us and in His world.
Well, it's safe to say we'll be in Galatians again this week.
We'll start in Galatians again. Paul begins to talk a little bit about his story. Not sure exactly what direction I'll take that. Wednesday is really my primary day to dive in and do a day of study for the conversations on Sunday. But so far, I've just been thinking about how sometimes we want to make sure, as we learn our own story with Christ, that we can connect the dots moving forward as well as backward, and being prepared to know what that story's about, but also kind of knowing how we share that, how that becomes a part of the kingdom formula that God has placed before us. So I think it's going to be a really good Sunday as we look into kind of what Paul shares about his own life.
We will have a little bit of a schedule change next week.
Right. Teek and I will be headed to camp. We will be going to camp midweek, so our podcast and all this stuff that we're going to do, we'll do on Monday, I think is what we're talking about. So it'll all be fresh on our mind, and we won't yet be preoccupied with loading up and going to camp.
Whatever.
Teak has a lot of students going to camp next Wednesday. That's exciting, and a lot of good stuff going on around here.
Yep. And then the next week after that is P3 pretty quick.
Right. We spent some good time yesterday talking about our P3 week. It's well organized, and Lisa and her team have done a great job. All the 5 locations are kind of coming together. And then 2 Sundays in June, end of June, we'll have P3 Sundays, commissioning Sunday, and then sort of the P3 week, and then a reflection Sunday, or a celebration Sunday actually. So that's a big part of what we do. It's Vacation Bible School in the Park. I can't ever remember what the 3 P's are.
Praise and party in the park.
That's right. We'll praise and party in the park, and there's going to be one near you if you live in Sweetwater.
Yes.
So we hope that you'll join us. We'd invite you to do that, and we look forward to that time together.
My sister-in-law is coming down to help with P3.
Oh, that's awesome.
She's going to be here for 2 days.
Oh, good deal. We do manage to get a lot of people involved in that, and it's a good thing.
So that's all I got today.
Well, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate you following along and listening along. Be sure and follow us, like us, subscribe. All those things help us to get the word out there and kind of invite people into our world of this little conversation that Teak and I have. So thanks for listening. We look forward to seeing you on Sunday.
See ya.